Hi all, welcome back. So today we're doing World War II, the war, as Ken Burns puts it in his multi-part miniseries of the war. Massively important in terms of the U.S. coming of age. In fact, U.S. emerges from World War II with no less than 50% of the world's wealth, which is actually becomes a problem in terms of trading, global trading, global prosperity. Hence the Marshall Plan. And we'll talk about that later. Any case today, the war it's a tough tough thing to capture. I teach a complete course on this, and in 12 weeks I find it really challenging to get it all in. We got 2 hours, so it's going to be quite a ride. In any case, here's what you'll be wanting to know, or what we'll be covering. Really hope you find it interesting. I think it's all super fascinating stuff, and our focus is on America. So in that way, you know that the 12-week 2 hour thing, we can do this. Okay. Anyways, nothing to it but to do it. So let's get started. Here we go. Okay, now as with World War I, Americans join late. 1939, Britain declares war. 1940, Hitler fights off the British, the Dutch, the Belgians, and the French on the continent, takes them all, sends the English fleeing from Dunkirk. You've seen the movie, you know this. He's already, before that, gobbled up Austria. The plebiscite was held. Austrians are generally pro-Nazi. Then he takes the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. It's given to him in the Munich Agreement, which is a disaster. It's really what brings on World War II, is that Munich Agreement giving Hitler, and it gives us the Munich lesson that you cannot appease a tyrant, because anyway, there's various reasons for that. Probably the biggest one is that it convinces Stalin that the Allies can't be trusted. They will surrender their friends. Already too much detail here, but in any case, know that Munich is a disaster, and understood that way. The Munich lesson rebounds through the decades since. Any case, Hitler takes the Sudeten region, which is ethnic Germans. After that, he wipes off the rest of Czechoslovakia. It's the first time he's going for non-German people and proving himself to be a liar. He's not only about reversing the Versailles Agreement. He's not only about getting all German people under Germany. He is a conqueror, right? And then he takes on Poland. And that's the point at which England and France declare war on him. Okay? At that point, it becomes clear that he's made a non-aggression pact with the Soviets, which stuns the world. Then he goes on to take, Hitler does, to take Norway, which is a huge disaster and leads directly to the fall of the British government and the rise of Churchill, who was somewhat responsible for what happened there in the taking of Norway, but in any case, is the man of the hour for having been anti-appeasement against Germany all along. And he forms a unity government, never voted in England, to take Norway. Also, Denmark has been wiped out. Sweden is not taken, not necessary for Hitler. He doesn't have to invade them, but they will support Hitler in his aims through the war. They give him access. In any case, now he goes for all the countries on Russia's border, right down, Romania, Hungary, and all the way down to Greece, Yugoslavia, in preparation for his big prize, which is Russia. Okay? And he attacks Russia in the spring of 1941. Almost takes it. He hopes that the idea with Barbarossa, Operation Barbarossa, is to take it in 16 weeks, and that fails. He is foiled then by General Winter, also Rasputitsa, the muddy roads that happen in the fall, which Russia has terrible road system, much to their benefit. Massive territory too, and also he's defeated there, foiled by a Russian tactical retreat, a brilliant retreat. Holocaust is also starting now with the SS execution squadrons beginning in Poland. Meantime, in the east, Japan has taken on China, and this story goes back to the 1930s. 1937 is the conquest out of Manchuria, Manchukuo, down to the rest of China. We get the Nanking incident, which is a butchering of 100,000 Chinese in Nanking, and the Japanese are planning for more. They take Indochina as a staging ground to take for a southern attack strategy, but not clear yet if they will go south or north. That's not clear until Pearl Harbor, and because the Japanese are also planning to attack Siberia. They have plans that way as well to attack Russia. Great question as to why the Japanese and the Germans do not work in tandem together against Russia. That would have been a better deal for them. Anyway, the British have made some progress in Africa. That's the only bright spot in the war so far, okay? Because it's just been loss after loss after loss for the British. But they're making some gains against the Italians. They've liberated Ethiopia. Egypt for now is secure, and they've pushed the Italians into they pushed into Libya. But the Mediterranean is still unsecured, and the Atlantic, meantime, is a U-boat hunter's paradise. Okay, so that is where things are at. So yeah, a lot going on before the Pearl Harbor attack, and there you go. That's kind of the story and the glory that's usually given in about a couple of weeks of lectures in a World War II class. But anyway, yeah, lots going on before the Pearl Harbor attack. And yet, though the Americans are last to the party, you might say, and it's controversial, you might say that U.S. involvement is the key for why the Allies won. Richard Overy has a book on this, Why the Allies Won the War, and that's one chapter there, just economic war and the American involvement. Now, not if you look at manpower or battles. The U.S. body count is a fraction of what others are bloodletting here in the war. So it's not manpower service. 418,000, almost entirely military, are killed on the American side in World War II. For the USSR, it's a staggering 24 million. Okay, 60% of them, as you can see here in this chart, are civilian. So to put that in perspective, Stalin shot about half as many Americans as died. So about half the American body count Stalin shot for desertion on the Soviet side. So for total US fatalities. The Russian death toll is 57 times as high as the Americans. So clearly the Russians are giving the most to break the German Wehrmacht. That is where the Wehrmacht, the German army, is killed off, right, in the millions, taken prisoner in massive numbers later in the war, and dies in very goodly numbers. Stalingrad being the bloodiest battle in world history, which sees about 1.5 million Axis soldiers killed. But yeah, it's one of those paradoxes, though, that capitalism, it is one of those paradoxes that capitalism in the West is largely saved through the exertions of the communists in World War II. But the longer the war goes on, the less it is about this, the more it becomes an economic war, a war of production. And this is where the U.S. entry seals it. This is why Allied industrial strength is 5 times that of the Axis by 1945 because of American entry. And the longer the war goes, the more it becomes an economic war. Hitler understood that. This is why Barbarossa had to be short, and it wasn't. And really it is American production that defeats the Axis. Okay, so I'll back that up a bit more in the next slide, or defend that in the next few. The U.S. is the world's largest economy, but more than that, it is the biggest industrial state. It's akin to China, where China is at today, where they manufacture. Their manufacturing is just gangbusters, right? It's the powerhouse, it's the juggernaut. The open secret being it's because of assembly line mass production. Now this image here shows B-24s being made by Ford in the largest factory in the world, that's Willow Run, and it's spitting out one every few hours. Ford is making only half of the 18,000 that get made during the war, and they're very expensive. Now this image here shows the P-38 fighter plane, also known as the Lightning or the Fork-tailed Devil. It is being made at Lockheed in Burbank, California, and it's coming down. It's fascinating because this is the assembly line production here. It's coming down the line on the right. Then these planes get shunted over to the middle where they get their wings and engines, and then they go backward to the end of the hangar, out the door to the painting hangar behind that, and are finished off. Later in the war, they're being flown across the Sierras to Colorado to be finished in to be finished with new innovations that are being implemented in this plane, but cannot be implemented at the factory fast enough, the original factory. So in any case, it doesn't matter. 10,000 of these are made at a cost of over 1 million each in today's currency. So yeah, very expensive, but it's continuous production. So the same thing we had in the auto plants, we're now seeing in war munitions, right? And you get the same principle in naval destroyers. You get the same in armored vehicles, tanks, small artillery, all the rest of it. And here, incidentally, is the most expensive weapon of the war. It's the B-29 bomber. The Enola Gay, which dropped the bomb in Hiroshima, was a B-29 bomber. Also known as a super fortress, it's designed as a high-altitude bomber, although over Japan it was generally brought in low, much to Curtis LeMay's disgust, because they would get shot down. In any case, has all sorts of firsts. It's got a pressurized cabin, it's got remote control guns, and it is the thing until the 1960s when the jet engine makes them obsolete. Now eventually about 4,000 of these are made, and that's at a per unit cost of about 10 million in today's money. So over 40 billion in today's currency on this plane alone. So the most expensive weapon of World War II. The Manhattan Project comes second for the American in that list, and that massive project, 130,000 people, 4 years. That cost about 30 billion. It takes a massive economy to be able to do this. Now, and again, a lot of this expertise comes from the auto industry. In fact, Chrysler built the engines for the B-29 at their Dodge plant, which it's a Dodge. Anyway, some stats for you. 1940, just to bring this home, in 1940, U.S. industry made 3,600 military aircraft. By 1944, they make 96,000. Okay, in total, over 300,000 during the war. Now, think on this. England, at the beginning of the Battle of Britain, had 750 fighter planes. Okay, 750. And as you know, they won that round. Okay? Or as you might not know, but yeah. And this isn't all being used by American forces either, right? And in fact, 2/3 of all Allied military equipment is made in the United States. 2/3 of all military equipment during World War II, Allied, is made in the U.S. And again, the point is, it takes a strong war economy to do this. Also, and this is key, it took massive government intervention through a war production board that is setting prices, it's setting wages, it's forcing industries to convert to military production, often against resistance. And this really matters because conservatives love to praise American entrepreneurial business minds for winning the war, right? And that kind of nonsense. There's a book called Freedom's Forge about that takes exactly that kind of line, right? American industry, entrepreneurial spirit. But no, it is the New Deal. It's socialist top-down state planning that does it, and it's against resistance. But it works. Okay? And here's William Knudsen, who had been he was the CEO of General Motors, and he becomes Roosevelt's president of GM. Roosevelt appointed him to director of war production, made him a general, which has never happened, a civilian becoming a general. But in any case, he says this, winning quote to him, which we'll end this point on. He says, "We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the likes of which he had never dreamed possible." And that's 100% accurate. Now, the problem is, of course, Americans are not in the war at the outset. And though they don't want England to go down in flames, they also don't want to get into another war in order to protect the British Empire, which is how they saw that and how the British saw that, or really any empire, the French included, who were now occupied. So FDR, he breaks with convention and seeks a controversial third term in 1940. And his preference is to give the Allies the tools to win, but to stay out of the war. And this is largely why he wins that election, because he promised that that would happen. So at the end of 1940, December 29, he gives this famous fireside chat on the radio where he appeals to the nation to provide more material support to Great Britain, promises that America will, and he argues that the best way to stay out of the war and preserve national security is to be what he calls the arsenal of democracy, which is just a great phrase. And it turns out George Gallup of the Gallup polls is just started doing polls. I believe it's his second year of doing this. And one of his very first polls is the next month, January 1941, confirming that 80% of Americans want to stay out of the war, but 70% of them favor aid to Britain. And what's incredible, that favoring aid to Britain is even at the risk of that drawing us into war. So 80% of Americans want to stay out of the war, 70% favor aid to Britain, even at the risk of drawing America into war, which is remarkably consistent also with what FDR had just laid out in his fireside chat, the Arsenal of Democracy speech. So this is January 1941. But yes, most want to stay out of war. 70% are willing to put their money where their mouth is, essentially. And if push comes to shove and we must go to war, fine, but rather not, FDR included. But America is also has this hardcore stream of isolationists. So the 30% who would not have agreed with that would be in this camp. Now, the most serious contender, the most serious group among this is the America First Committee, the America First Committee. And the leader of that is, one of the leaders is the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh, who had achieved instant fame for being the first to fly solo across the Atlantic. Now, he would tell audiences, and they come out in droves to hear him, that he'd, quote, rather go to war against the Soviets than Germany, end quote. And this is a really common feeling for good reason. These people are dead opposed to war. Many feel also that the UK will shortly lose out. They are surrounded by U-boats, and they should negotiate and sign a peace treaty with Hitler or face invasion. So either way, they're going down. Best case is if they sign a peace treaty, and they feel that that is imminent in 1941. So there's really no point coming to the defense of a country that is about to be defeated. More extreme isolationism is the American Nazis, and there's many of them. Lindbergh is not one, even though he was German background and he had lived there in the 30s for a time. And in fact, that's what had convinced him that Germany was about to defeat England, having lived in Germany. But it's the American Nazis, not as significant politically, but they represent the far right in America. They complete opposition to war. They openly admire Hitler. They really admire what he's done to challenge communism, and they will have big rallies in Madison Square Gardens. But yeah, they're a minority. Some big names, though, in America are pro-German, and one of them is Joe Kennedy, JFK's father. He's an ambassador in England, as is Henry Ford, who is rapidly anti-Semitic and famously so. Now, all of this isolationism evaporates after December 6, 1941, after Pearl Harbor. So the question then is, would America have entered the war anyways, had Pearl Harbor not happened? And the answer is, yeah, probably. Okay, so let me explain and defend that. And the answer there is the Battle of the Atlantic. This is where the U.S. is really getting drawn in, and it's the slippery slope. Just like in World War I, the Americans are discovering again that it's impossible to be a fireproof house in a globalized economy. And the Atlantic is absolutely critical to the U.S. economy. And now with the Germans controlling all of Europe and blockading England, it's inevitable you're going to see clashes here. So this is a theme also that goes all the way back to the War of 1812. In fact, if you do American history, you'll see that this is a long-standing theme. As in World War I, the Germans also rediscovered the advantages of the submarine in trying to strangle Britain, and pretty effectively too. They end up sinking hundreds of Allied ships in 1941. All told, they would sink close to 3,000 merchant ships in World War II, 175 warships. Okay? Now, much of this is American goods, of which England is relying on more than ever to stay alive because they're not trading with continental Europe. England needs 1 million tons a week simply to stay to feed its own population, let alone to arm for defense or for a planned invasion of Europe, which seems very unlikely at this point. But anyway, it gets to a point where they're about 6 weeks away from mass starvation, hence Churchill's quote about the only thing that scared him. Now, this slide has a map showing where the U-boat is most successful early in this battle, and that is in the mid-Atlantic gap. And this gap exists because it's where long-range bombers cannot reach. Only very long-range bombers can fly more than 600 miles from the coast, and those are not yet coming on stream. The B-24 is really the first, the Liberator's the first very long-range bomber, and then the B-29, but they don't come on service until 1941. Now, the second map shows, there up on the top right, shows what happens after American entry. Counterintuitively, now it's not in the mid-Atlantic that we see the war. We see it on the coast of America. The U-boats are very active here, and they're doing better than ever. And why is that? You would think with the Americans in, it would, and that's the whole point of this lecture, that it reverses things. But the thing with the Battle of the Atlantic is with American entry, there's no more limits on where the U-boat can hunt, and they're going for easy pickings on the U.S. seaboard in the Gulf of Mexico, taking down ships that are backlit by American cities that have not yet gone into blackout mode. And it doesn't help that FDR tells the civilian population to get out there and spot U-boats, which gets everybody spotting any dolphin. It becomes a unnecessary response. Hemingway gets out with his own boat, mounts a machine gun on the front of it. Anyway, it's a joke. The U-boats are doing very effective at this point, and at that point too, the Americans busy in the Pacific campaign. It's decided that the Canadian Navy will be given the task of convoy protection in Northwest Quadrant. They're overwhelmed because they're growing into becoming what ends up being the third or fourth biggest navy in the world in 1945 from having almost nothing. But coincidentally, they are given this task at the point of U-boat production peaking. Okay, so not great times. And so the Germans break it up into the U-boat war into the first happy times and the second happy times, as you can see there, where they are at their most effective. But taking us back to 1941, it's in the context of American merchant shipping being sunk and American merchant mariners being killed at sea that we start seeing an alliance forming with the UK. And first, in fact, is the US planning for an outbreak of war with Germany and what are called the Rainbow Plans. Now, these are not super important. Every nation makes plans for every possible scenario. But then we get the ABC talks in Washington and DC, and this is military staffs only. It's the UK, the US, and Canada, and it ends with an agreement that FDR puts the US Navy on what's called the neutrality patrol, which is actually not very neutral. And these are Western Atlantic patrols that the US Navy is on, where they are told to report on U-boats to the British in order to better protect these merchant ships. And then, of course, inevitably, following a U-boat incident, the U.S. Navy is getting drawn in more, and now they're given a shoot-on-sight directive to protect themselves. Then, to protect shipping lines further, the U.S. takes Greenland and Iceland. Iceland had been taken by the British already, and they transfer it to America, and this is April 1941. So these Greenland and Iceland are now U.S. occupied protectorates. Denmark is occupied by Germany, so Greenland is undefended, and hence the Allies grab it before Germany can. Then finally, we get a repeal of a section of the Neutrality Acts from the 1930s that prohibited the arming of U.S. merchant ships. So now U.S. merchant ships are armed. And then finally in October, the Germans sink a U.S. destroyer, an American destroyer, the Reuben James, so U.S. Navy. About 100 servicemen are killed. This is out near Iceland. And the fact is, as I said, neutrality patrol is anything but neutral. It is protecting a convoy, the Reuben James, and it had been dropping depth charges on U-boats, so hardly neutral. In any case, that's the logical slippery slope that sees Americans being drawn into war in the Battle of the Atlantic before war begins. Now, a really big moment in all of this is the Atlantic Charter, the signing of the Atlantic Charter, which happens in the very first real meeting between FDR and Churchill. They'd met briefly before this at some point, but this is their first real face-to-face conversation. And it happens in August 1941 on a U.S. ship off the coast of Argentia, Newfoundland. And in it here, the two countries outline their shared goals. So the shared goals of the United States and Great Britain for the post-war world. So this is emphasizing principles like self-determination, free trade, and open seas, open navigation, and international cooperation. So it's not a formal treaty. It's serving as a statement of war aims, though. So think of it as analogous to like a constitution or a Bill of Rights, and some will say that this is the basis really of the UN Declaration of Human Rights that follows the war. But it's a really powerful and important signal that Americans stand for this, which is a few things, right, including the freedom of all people to self-determination. Now, that's a really interesting one, especially as Britain still has many colonies that are seeking exactly that. So this serves FDR's notice to the American public that he is not going to get involved with anyone, any defense of any empire. Right? So this is much like Wilson's 14 points. And the language here is we respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live, and wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. So so they're in favor of seeing sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have had that forcibly deprived from them. Now the British, that kind of gives the British a bit of wiggle room in signing this. They could tell themselves that language, captures or includes the invaded democracies of Europe that are under the Nazi boot, but not really their empire, not say India, which in any case is really a British creation. It's an amalgamation of hundreds of pre-existing states. But really the fact is they'll sign anything at this point. Churchill will sign anything at this point to get support, psychological and propaganda support, if that's all it can be at this moment, for his war aims. Either way, it's a pretty blunt on who the enemy is to world peace. And in fact, it talks about a post-war world where people live in freedom, quote, after the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny. So very blunt on who the enemy to world peace is. Okay? But again, this is not a declaration of war quite yet. Okay? Super important, but not that. Okay, finally, I'm going to give you 3 more consequential things that happened just before American entry in the years before that, and that is 1, the destroyers for bases deal. This is late 1940, where the Americans give 50 U.S. naval destroyers to the British on the condition that the British then give them 99-year leases to the Americans on 7 British bases in the Western Hemisphere that ranged from Gander, Newfoundland, which at that point is a British colony, not part of Canada, down to the Bahamas, Jamaica, Guyana, places like that. Now, these are seen by the British as gangster tactics. That's a direct quote from Anthony Eden, politician Anthony Eden, and they really are. The Germans have their boot on our neck, and now you're demanding 100-year leases from our, trying to carve up our empire. But this totally fits with where Roosevelt, his messaging to the American people, that whatever we are in or not in, it is not for the defense of the British Empire. And in fact, we'll take advantage of this weakness at this point to drive home that point. The other thing is that is consequential here is the draft of 1940. Okay, and why this matters so much is because it's the first time in U.S. history that there's a national military draft in peacetime. So FDR is doing something that's never been done before in peacetime. Okay? The national military draft, and it requires all men between the ages of 21 and 36 to register. First peacetime draft, as I said, and most Americans are in favor of this, according to polls at the time. Once the U.S. enters World War II, draft terms get extended for the duration of the fighting, so you're in it for the long haul, and by the end of the war, an incredible 50 million men between 18 and 45, they extended the age, had registered for the draft. And at its peak, the U.S. Army was at 12.3 million men in uniform. So its peak strength was 12.3 million men. By comparison, the Red Army saw 34 million men serve, far more than the Americans, but its peak strength was also the same. It was in the 11 to 13 million range. And what's even more interesting is it's the same with the German army, the Wehrmacht as well, peaks at between 10 and 12 million personnel. Now this tells us a couple things, and one is that just as with World War I, the numbers are very much in favor of the Allies. Secondly, is just how pivotal, important U.S. involvement, U.S. numbers are in the defeat of Germany. In any case, the third point I want to give you is Lend-Lease, and this is super important. Simply the Americans lending money, and Canadians, to Britain and later to Russia to stay in the war. So it's material aid, it's direct aid, it's either cash or it's supplies that are promised to pay deal. Okay, buy now, pay later, and that's exactly what happens. The British are paying this off in a long-term mortgage rate up until 2007. January 2007 is the last check cut from the British Crown the British budget to Canada and the United States for its support in World War II, which is absolutely pivotal. Of course, Pearl Harbor will make all of this immaterial, and at that point, it'll become Churchill's big plan to get Europe, to get America united on a Europe first strategy. But in any case, how is it that the Japanese attack America? Why? Why do they do this when really America is the one country that can most readily destroy them and all of their plans? Great question, and in fact, the question contains the answer. And the fact is the Japanese get to a point where they think they have no choice but to neutralize the biggest threat to their plans. That really Americans must be taken out of the equation for the success of their war plans. And in a way that makes sense, and you have to understand in the context of what's going on with the war in China, and also diplomacy with Americans who have been engaged in this region with diplomacy since Teddy Roosevelt, as you know. So how does it come to war? Largely because the Americans end up being the lead nation, still negotiating with the Japanese as they take increasingly bigger actions in the Pacific. So the Japanese were concerned for some time. 1905, they invaded Korea and they remade it into a Japanese province. 1931, they invade Manchuria and they do essentially the same thing, rename it Manchukuo, and they install the last emperor, the deposed emperor of China, as a puppet dictator there. 1937, the Imperial Japanese Army invades the rest of mainland China in the context of a civil war there between the nationalists and the communists. And then they invade Indochina, a French colony, French Indochina, today's Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. To shock them into reality at that point, the Americans now slap Japan with the infamous oil embargo. Okay. Now this really matters because Japan has no domestic supply and is relying on American oil, particularly for their war machine to operate in China. So this makes them more desperate. And to try and keep it simple, after this, the Americans, after the invasion of Indochina and the embargo, and by the way, now instead of keeping it simple, I'll complicate it. The negotiations are being engaged with by the Secretary of State Cordell Hull. Secretary of State is an appointed position. It's probably the most powerful appointed position in the world. It's often a step into the White House, not always. Cordell Hull is the Secretary of State at the time, and his office slaps the Japanese with with a limitation on oil purchases, okay? Not meant to be a full embargo. Also freezing of Japanese assets in the U.S., there's more to it. But his undersecretary, Dean Acheson, translates it, figures out ways to translate it into a de facto complete embargo. And he does that for a couple months while Colonel Hall is involved with other things. The world is on fire, Britain's going down, yada, yada. Busy days for the State Department. So Dean Acheson, being a bit of a war hawk and also a sinologist, he's a defender of China, as are many in the U.S. Navy and other Far East diplomats who also play a part in pulling America into war to defend China. He translates it into a full-on embargo, and this is how the Japanese understand it. Anyway, it does make them that much more desperate. After that, the Americans break the Japanese diplomatic code. Okay, they have 330 men working on it full time, and it's a pretty massive break here. Their diplomatic code is called Purple. The intel from it is called Magic. In any case, they find out that the Japanese are planning to use Indochina as a staging ground to take over the rest of the region, including the American Philippines, Guam, the East Indies, the Dutch East Indies, which not hard to do now. Holland being occupied, Indochina was easy to take because France is occupied, and the collaborationist Vichy regime is in charge of the empires, so they are supposed to be allies. In reality, they're not. Any case, yeah, the Japanese war plans extend further. It's all under what they call their co-prosperity sphere. They aim to cut the sea lanes from America to Australia. Ultimate goal really is to control everything from East Africa all the way to the American mainland. 25% of the world's population ideally will be serving in their empire. So what the Americans discover from this then is that they're really negotiating in bad faith with the Japanese. They're making these bold plans while negotiating with them. And to keep things short, on November 26, 1941, Secretary Hall finally presents the Americans' last offer for a peace deal with the Japanese. And he gives that document to the two Japanese envoys in Washington, Nomura and Kurusu, who are pictured there. In fact, this is the very last meeting that they have, that top right image. And the Japanese perceive that as an ultimatum. Now, what the Hall note says is the Japanese to restore relations with America diplomatically, to have a peace deal with America, essentially they will have to not just pull out of Indochina, but also commit to getting out of China. That is a non-negotiable for them. So in some ways you can say that the Americans really go to war in defense of China. At the end of the day, they want the Japanese army out of China, and that's their bottom line. The Japanese will not agree to that. And in fact, by the time this Hall note has been passed to the Japanese on November 26th, the fleet, Admiral Yamamoto, is already sailing for Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor. What can you say that isn't already said by the Ben Affleck movie of 2001? Clearly it was a love story. Yeah, no. If you want to watch a good film on that, watch Tor. It gives both sides, the Japanese and the American perspective. But in any case, yeah, it's using 6 aircraft carriers, 420 planes, a surprise dawn attack, with a warning handed to the Americans famously afterwards. Yamamoto, Admiral Yamamoto, is Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese fleet, co-commander of this operation. He famously had said beforehand, if I am told to fight the Americans, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year. Really interesting that he's that prescient, that understands, what we have provoked here. There's a lot of debates about Pearl Harbor, including why, one of them is why didn't the Imperial Japanese Navy stick around for a spoiling action, for a second attack? In the end, they essentially sank 4 battleships, killed several thousand, but not a lot of material damage other than that, or not a lot of material damage. The ships that are damaged are repairable, and importantly, you probably know this, and maybe you've heard it. They don't get any of the aircraft carriers. There were 3 stationed in Pearl Harbor. One of them is on the mainland being repaired. 2 of them are out of harbor. Those are the big prize. They take years to build. Japan at this point only has 10. The States at this point only has 7. So that would have done enormous damage, and they could have, including the infrastructure, the oil depot, and all the rest. But yeah, other debates too about a U.S. lack of preparation, and that really explains the many, many investigations that follow. Blame is put on Kimmel and Short, the admiral, the general, the Army and Navy there, general and admiral, unfairly as it turns out. But in any case, and then there was conspiracy theories about FDR knowing this and not, not telling the Army and Navy or choosing to get his war. That kind of conspiracy theory is complete nonsense. The Americans did expect an attack, but they expected it would happen in Guam, not in Pearl Harbor. In any case, it definitely was that day of infamy that FDR describes it. The next day, and there you have his famous speech that more than 80% of Americans listened to on the radio. Very massive moment in U.S. history, clearly. Now, what's often forgotten in all of this is not just Pearl Harbor that is hit. By the time FDR is speechifying about the day of infamy, the Japanese have already hit the Philippines. They've attacked Clark Field, the main base there. And incredibly, the Americans didn't scramble their planes, and they disabled then half the U.S. Pacific aircraft fleet right there. This is only 8.5 hours after Pearl Harbor. Then there's a land invasion that goes on for a while. It ends in Douglas MacArthur fleeing the Philippines, and he leaves behind thousands of American and Filipino soldiers to their fate. 70,000 of them, north of 70,000 of them, then are captured, and they're forced march north on the famous Patton Death March, 65 miles, where they sail for prisoner camps. Those that make it, thousands die on the Death March, and they get into the aptly named coffin ships, which take them to prison camps where 1 in 3 Americans have a 1 in 3 chance of dying in those camps before they get liberated. Same day, December 8, Japan attacks Hong Kong, and which the Canadians had gone to defend, and Churchill had privately said was completely indefensible, and it turns out it was. And that battle is over by December 25. In short order, they'll go on to take Malaysia, then Singapore by February. They'll take the East Indies, they'll take Papua New Guinea, they'll take Burma. They even get into East India, which is a real forgotten front of the war. And everywhere they go, they're just being brutal. As they were in China, they are massacring the Chinese populations, these areas who are singled out. They're at war with China. They're killing hospital patients, and they're just being brutal to prisoners, which we'll get back to, but it's partly a function of the Bushido Code, that ethic, fight to the death ethic, meaning not a lot of respect for a soldier who surrenders and is captured. Like the Sergeant Leonard Siflete here, who's one of the Australian New Zealanders captured in Papua New Guinea, the Anzac troops that were fighting there. In any case, somebody is happy about Pearl Harbor, and that is Winston Churchill. Maybe that's not a polite way of saying, but he is saved by Pearl Harbor. And in fact, 6 days after, December 13, he sails to the United States with a 3-destroyer squadron for protection because of the Battle of the Atlantic and the U-boat threat. And he basically moves in with a few hours' notice to FDR that he's staying over Christmas, and he stays 4 more weeks after that and sets up office. And he's not the easiest house guest. Yeah, Eleanor Roosevelt was given a day's warning to prepare for some guests, not sure who it would be, and to stock up on extra Christmas presents and plenty of whiskey. And she comes to despise Churchill pretty quickly. Churchill's a notoriously big drinker, even by the standards of the upper-class English of the day. His first drink of the day is always at 9 a.m. He calls it his mouthwash, Johnny Walker Red Label. Anyway, more than you need to know. And Eleanor had grown up with an alcoholic father, so she's not having it. Wirt's house guest. He keeps FDR up all night into the morning hours, and then while the president has to get up early to deal with running the country, Churchill will sleep till noon, right? So the visit definitely takes a toll on FDR, and there's no love lost between Churchill and a very powerful First Lady. Which is just whatever. But in any case, Churchill is saved by Pearl Harbor, and he's sticking very close, ensuring that FDR sticks to the policy of Europe first. And the logic here is, one, Japan is weak, Germany is not. So the focus must be on the greater threat. And the collapse of Japan is inevitable once Germany is defeated. The second point on the Europe first idea is that if the US focuses on the Pacific, Hitler then could defeat Russia, after which Europe is going to become this unconquerable fortress. So Europe first is the idea. Defensive strategy or containment of the Pacific against the weaker state, which Japan really was, and offensive in the Atlantic, where at that moment U-boats are having a field day. Worst period in the Battle of the Atlantic is July 1942, when, beginning of 42 to March 43, 7 million tons are lost in merchant shipping. July 1942 is a nadir, 173 ships sunk in a single month. That's the worst point. And Germans are winning the numbers game. That same time, July 42, new boats are coming, new subs are coming on at the rate of 30 each month, right? The Allies only managed to sink 21 submarines in the first 6 months of 1942, just over 3 a month. So it's clear the Germans are succeeding in strangling Britain. And they're also producing continually more lethal subs. The Germans had cracked British shipping codes as well, so to some extent they know where the convoys are, even though the convoys try and maintain radio silence. And they've got this really effective strategy of surface steaming at right angles to a convoy route by day, and then if they find a convoy, they get a contact report, or they send out a contact report, and all these other U-boats converge there, and then they have a coordinated attack at night. So they'll surface in the middle of these massive convoys, which are a grid pattern, and they'll take them out. 1940, as I said, Allied air coverage only 300 miles from the coast, a long time before that ocean gap closes, but it does start to. And very long-range bombers by 1943 are closing the gap. They're coming out of Newfoundland, and they've closed that gap. As I said, American entry wasn't what was expected. It actually made things worse. Canadians now are in charge of the Northwest Atlantic Command and are always behind the 8 ball as their Navy is growing. So I'm repeating myself here, but I'll just cut to the chase on what changes the Battle of the Atlantic in favor of the Allies. And one is the invention of shortwave radar, which is able to overcome the problem of wave interference that long-range radar had. Another is ASDIC, which is sound navigation and ranging sonar. Another is Huff-Duff, by which you could triangulate messages from subs. And Admiral Dönitz of the Kriegsmarine of the German Navy was a micromanager, always sending out messages. So with Huff-Duff, they could triangulate and position these subs better. So he's sending out like 70 messages a day to his sub commanders, and that's a brilliant thing. The other thing, of course, is the Enigma cipher, and that campaign to decode Enigma. And if you've seen the movie Imitation Game, you know exactly about that story. Yeah, and a lot of things that you'll see in that movie about Enigma are accurate. They do break the code. It's more complicated in that there are thousands of people working on it, not simply this little team. And it is these statistical biases, because the Enigma cipher is impossible to crack. It has something like 103 trillion permutations. It's physically impossible by humans to crack it. With that, the Colossus computer is invented, which is interesting. But it's really mistakes that the Germans make in sending messages and repeating the same things and figuring out what those are that leads to the Enigma being cracked. A 5th rotor is added at one point. There's 4 rotors in the Enigma cipher. When the 5th rotor is employed, we again get 6 months of silence before that is cracked with these with this amazing effort that actually began with the Poles. The Poles were the ones who began the cryptanalysis and then took that information to England and they developed that further. In any case, it's a fascinating part of the war, and it is said that the cracking of the Enigma cipher did shorten the war significantly. So that is objectively true. But more to the point, and this is what I wanted to get at you, is the campaign really goes in. It becomes really a war of attrition, where the productive capacity of the Americans finally overwhelms what the Axis can do, what the Germans can do by way of production. So as that and better technology in sinking subs, two of which were the Lee light, which is a big torch that can get a sub as it's surfacing, and so you can attack it before it manages to sink while it's surfacing, recharging its batteries, so it can hone in on it from a mile away. And another is Hedgehog, which is a grid pattern of bombs that's not as satisfying as depth charges, in that you don't get the big boom, but it's much more effective at taking subs out. So you get a 2/3 increase in the kill rate just because of the Hedgehog. But the bigger thing is the Germans are outproduced by the Americans, and Americans are building, famously, they're building the Liberty ship, and it's not a well-built ship, but thousands and thousands of them are built. So the merchant marine is getting much larger. Henry J. Kaiser is the American shipbuilder whose company designed the Liberty ship. Some of them were built at the Burrard shipyards in Vancouver. They're built all over North America, yeah, it's a production gap that really does it. Now, the Battle of the Atlantic will go on, but not as it was. As of May 1943, the Germans are pulling their U-boats out of the North Atlantic because they can't sustain operations there with their heavy losses. Now, this, of course, allows for the resupply of England in preparation for the invasion, the liberation of Europe through France, and that is the game plan, certainly for the Americans, not for the British. And that's something that many don't appreciate, is that Churchill is completely non-committal and actually completely opposed to this big operation. And why is that? So, well, it's a few things. One is he is keenly aware that the UK barely has resources for this, let alone for a second attempt should the first one fail. Meanwhile, the Americans completely the opposite. They have enough material for this, and they're getting more all the time. But Churchill has also learned, as have the British people, that the Germans are really a superior fighting force, and they are nothing to underestimate. So he really fears that this will fail. And amphibious assaults are notoriously difficult. This is why Hitler didn't in the end launch an invasion of England. You need aerial supremacy for that to work, and everything has to go right. In any case, for the British, it's been a series of failures. You've had the fall of France, you've had the evacuation of Dunkirk, the fall of Greece, the massive evacuation there from Athens to Africa. You have the Africa campaign started out well for the UK when it was just against the Italians, but when Hitler sends the Wehrmacht there, when he sends Erwin Rommel and the Africa Corps, they pushed the British all the way back to Cairo, even though they had much smaller numbers initially. So what Churchill wants is a periphery strategy. His preference is for getting the Germans at their points of what he sees as their weakest points. Right? And one of those is he hopes to launch something called Operation Jupiter, which is taking back Norway and Finland, and then combined forces in North Africa, which he sees as a winnable campaign, and he sees that as a point of weakness for the Germans. And then launching an attack into Europe, preferably from multiple points in the Mediterranean, which he calls the soft underbelly of Europe, which turns out to be anything but soft. Now, the Americans are completely impatient with this. They call it pinprick warfare. They call it scatterization. And in fact, Harry Stimson, the U.S. Secretary of War, even says that this is a function of a, quote, fatigued and defeatist government. versus a young and vigorous nation. So, which is a hell of a statement to make about the British, who have been in it for years already. In any case, and it really comes almost to blows at the different conferences where this is discussed in Quebec and then later in Casablanca. But yeah, finally in June 1942, FDR agrees to Churchill's plan for a joint operations invasion of North African colonies, which are held by Vichy, France, preparation to an invasion of Italy, with a promise from Churchill that there would be an invasion of France in the spring of 1943. Okay? And also an operation called Operation Sledgehammer, which is a contingency plan for later in 1942, for an invasion later in 1942, if the USSR fails. So if Germany succeeds in getting the USSR out of the game, then they will push up the timeline and have our D-Day in 1942. Okay, so that is the setup. FDR agrees against the advice of his generals, or the desires of his generals, who are chomping at the bit to take Europe for a D-Day that year. He agrees to the Africa campaign, and so we get Operation Torch. And just context to that, the Italians had been losing against the British in Egypt and India, in Egypt and Libya, and Hitler had sent in the Africa Corps, as I said, initially just 16,000, but growing bigger all the time as we get these back and forth battles over here. Desert War, fascinating. It features massive routes where 1,000 miles advance is not uncommon. Okay, so a lot of back and forth here. But when the Allies land 107,000 men, our first amphibious assault of the war and the first American action in Europe, in Morocco and Algeria there, as you can see in the map. This happens on November 8, Operation Torch, as per the plan. Hitler's response the next day is to send 150,000 more, as per that same map there. You see they're coming over from Sicily. But really, to no real purpose, as the Germans under Rommel now lose out to Montgomery and his British and Commonwealth forces in Egypt in the Second Battle of El Alamein, just right away after. All of this happens about the same time. The British victory in El Alamein coincides with the Torch landings. It's just 3 days later. And so now you have, look at the other map now, the black and white one, you have this pincer with the Germans retreating to Tunisia. And what we get is we end up having a 6-month battle there. And Tunisia is uniquely, yeah, geographically it's easy to defend with the Atlas Mountains. Okay, so we get a long battle there, including a massive loss for the Americans, which is the Battle of Kasserine Pass in the Atlas Mountains into Tunisia. 3,300 Americans are killed in action, 180 tanks are lost. Now this is a first tank-to-tank battle for a very green U.S. Army. And they win some valuable lessons here about the integration of artillery and air support, and also about coordination with allies. Ultimately, the Africa Corps is taken prisoner. The Allies, as I said, it's a 6-month battle. They push them to the coast, and they take 180,000 German soldiers. Huge, huge victory. And now it'll be on to Sicily and Italy. Now, the importance of the Africa campaign, and the reason I spent so much time on it, because it is very important, is, well, a few things. One is the Allies secure the Mediterranean after a battle of the Mediterranean that's going on for years, largely over these access points like Malta. But that means that they saved their access to the Suez Canal. And that's really critical, because that is the access to oil, and which a lot of command decisions in World War II come down to oil. It also gives the U.S. Army some valuable lessons that it really needed, as I said, in tank warfare, but also in amphibious assault training, because they came up against a kind of non-committal, but the Vichy French do fight back. So it's a 4-day assault in Casablanca and Oran. It's not a cakewalk as the Americans had hoped it would be, given that these are French soldiers who are allied with the Germans, but it was really unclear how hard they would fight against their former allies. In any case, also, another important thing is the Italian army is broken. Massive losses, prisoners. They're pretty much done, and Italians are losing appetite for war with these losses. And they're starting to turn on Mussolini, which they ultimately will do after the Sicily campaign. Africa also becomes important for other reasons. It becomes exactly what American generals like Eisenhower had feared. It becomes a real big delay because of that stand that Hitler took in Tunisia. So to the point that there's no way that D-Day is going to happen in 1943. So a D-Day delay, and Germans have more time now to prepare their coastal defenses in France. Which is the unfortunate side of that. So they can strengthen the so-called Atlantic Wall in preparation for what will happen there. So really, Africa really dictates how the rest of the war will unfold, which again is why I wanted to spend some time on it. You also see a theme here that will haunt the Allied command for the whole war, which is the challenge of combined forces trying to work in tandem. The British and Americans are often at odds over priorities, and added to that is difficulty. The British themselves have 15 countries in their ranks, so that's a real challenge as well, and that will really manifest in Italy as we have these various ethnicities all fighting under American command there. But anyway, it's made a lot worse by these arrogant prima donna generals who are really hell to manage, and some of whom are egotistic to the point of mental illness. Two big names there, mainly, but not the sole examples of this are General George C. Patton, who actually believes he's a reincarnation of Hannibal the Great, and that's only, I'm just scratching the surface there on him. Anyway, and then there's Bernard Montgomery, who is arrogant, rude, has a total inability to accept blame consistently. Definitely up there, high up there on the spectrum. He'd be definitely diagnosed that way today. Neither of these two show much respect to Ike Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, and tend to do their own things. Ike Eisenhower didn't see service in World War I, so they don't respect him that way, but he's a very well-chosen leader. He's a diplomat, he's a good listener, and he manages to eat a lot of you-know-what, so that to make this thing work. Later will become president, as you probably know. Unlike Churchill, by the way, overall, Ike Eisenhower is a skilled diplomat. Churchill is a pretty atrocious supreme commander. Churchill is both the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense, and by personality, he involved himself intimately in the war planning in a way that FDR wisely chose not to. Well, other than there's a couple exceptions to that for FDR, but like Hitler, he keeps telling his generals to simply strike without really understanding the situation on the ground. And in fact, Montgomery's appointment prior to the Second Battle of El Alamein is the fourth dress change in command in Africa. Churchill has burned through 3 other generals before landing on him. He likes Monty because he's impetuous, which for Churchill means he's got the right stuff. But the real reason Monty succeeds, actually, is where others had not, is changes in intel. The Allies had cracked the German-African cipher, so they knew Rommel's plans, they knew the order of battle, they knew the Axis supply ship movements. And that, too, is another important theme and a reason we talk about Africa, because this continues throughout. Right? The German soldier is superior, but the Allies have the advantage in intel, which is a really significant advantage, right? That grows over time during World War II. So it's particularly important in the later stages of the conflict. So I started the lecture talking about overall resources. The Allies definitely have the advantage, which grows over time, but also in intelligence. Code breaking is a really big part of the equation. Okay, so that is the Africa campaign, and now, as I said, on to Sicily and Italy. And as per that code breaking and the intel thing, if you know Operation Mincemeat, and there's a good documentary about that now, the Allies managed to convince the Germans that the attack on southern Europe is going to be at Sardinia and at Greece, and they do that by floating a corpse with a briefcase that spells out these plans. It's a really interesting story, but again, a good example of the success of British and American intelligence in the war. Okay, so now we are on to the Sicily and Italian campaign, which become well, Sicily, not super long. What we have there, what you want to know about it, not a lot, but there's a race for Messina between Montgomery and Patton. Again, part of what I was talking about before, where ego matters more than working together. And by the way, there is a book about this called The War Between the Generals. Okay, The War Between the Generals. It's got a subtitle I can't remember, but it's by a guy named David Irving, which is unfortunate because David Irving turns out to be a bit of a I wouldn't say Nazi, but a Holocaust denier and I guess German sympathizer. But he talks. This book is dated now; it's early '80s. But he talks about the division in command and how many men lost their lives because of the competing egos of the generals on the Allied side. In any case. Important point. So Sicily is taken. What you want to know about Sicily, again, more training in amphibious assaults, and it goes well. It's actually a bigger amphibious landing than we have at D-Day, and Canadians are involved here, as are the Commonwealth troops. And as the Allies chase the Germans out of Sicily, and unfortunately many of them escape across the Italian mainland, the government or the Mussolini's government crumbles. There's riots in Rome, and the Italians are simply done with the war, and he is ordered to the king's palace, where he is promptly fired. And that's something people forget, is that the monarch stays in power in Italy throughout the war. So really, Mussolini is not. He has sidelined the king, but at this point, the king has power again because Mussolini is seen as illegitimate. Unfortunately, it takes the Italians 45 days then to negotiate a peace treaty to join the Allies, and in that time, the Germans get the time that they need to set up a defensive line in the Gustav Line, which will become a real bloodbath as the Allies try to take the Italian peninsula. And that's just a really super unfortunate circumstance, and to put it mildly. As one historian says, the Italians were as bad at making peace as they were at making war. So this delay, Germans set up this Gustav Line, and it won't be their last defensive line in Italy. What happens too now is, with the fall of the Italian government of Mussolini, and with them out of the war and joining the Allies, Hitler immediately turns on his former Italian allies and treats them as the enemy that they are. And in fact, what we get is these wide-scale massacres by Germans of entire divisions. Kefalonia was brutal. It took them days to kill thousands of men here. There's a Nicolas Cage movie about that. I keep talking about movies, but the Captain Corelli's Mandolin. Anyway, just brutal stuff. So the Italians are out of the war. Hitler has made the decision to defend the Italian peninsula, which is a dubious command decision, but and it becomes this campaign that will last till the very end of the war, and becomes a real bloodbath for the Allies for a variety of reasons. And one of which is that the Italian peninsula is uniquely designed for these defensive fortifications, where the Germans can really dig in. Canadians, we lose about 500 there in the Battle of Bertona, which is just north of the Gustav Line there, but part of it. And as you can see in that lower map, there's only one approach into Ortona. 5,000 Canadians end up dying in the Italian campaign overall. About 75,000 Allied soldiers will die here. Okay, so it is. It's definitely a major front in the war. Now, mistakes are made here too, and it's worth talking a bit about this and parking on this just a little bit. And one is the landings made at Anzio, which is north of the Gustav line, which is meant to put the Germans in a pincer from the north and south. Now, Anzio becomes this on-again, off-again thing. It's under General Clark, U.S. General Clark. Inadequate numbers, just 2 divisions. Over optimism and other mistakes. In the end, 7,000 are killed in action here over a 5-month period where we see trench warfare, much like World War I. A lot of this is blamed on Clark for not pushing his advantage when he had it and for digging in. Any case, we finally get a break of the Gustav line in what's called Operation Diadem. That's the 4th attempt to break it. It finally works. But now, rather than do as he's supposed to, which is to block the Germans' retreat north, which he's ordered to do actually by British General Alexander, and here again this theme we're talking about. Alexander is now put in charge of the Italian campaign. Eisenhower is off now for in England to prep for Operation Overlord D-Day. But in any case, so here we have the wider context. President Roosevelt has intimated that Rome should be conquered by American troops. That would be a huge prize, especially for Italian Americans, which is a big part of the U.S. population. But in any case, hasn't ordered that. But the American commander on the scene is General Clark. He disobeys the orders of his commander, British General Alexander, to cut off the German line of retreat. So instead, he orders his troops to capture Rome, get that big prize. And as a result, the German 10th Army under Albert Kesselring, which is Kesselring's an amazing general, they slipped the noose. They managed to escape capture, and unfortunately, they can reestablish a defense line in northern Italy, and that's called the Gothic Line. Which is a 10-mile deep belt of German fortifications. And breaking that line would cost the Allies another 40,000 casualties. So, yeah, in any case, another example of what I'm talking about, what we saw already in Africa. Now, the takeaways here, Rome is taken 1 day before the D-Day landings, so Clark quickly forgotten anyway. So that moment of glory is very short because D-Day takes over the media. And yeah, a question remains, was Italy a useless front? Not in terms of the lessons learned, again. And also with the taking of Rome, the Allies now have, which by the way strategically was not, what Clark did there strategically made no sense, just to reiterate that. But yeah, with the taking of central Italy, the Allies now have secured airfields around a place called Foggia, spelled Foggia. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Giving you more than you need here. But by 1944, there's 24 airfields in operation here supporting the strategic bombing missions of Germany, which is something I haven't yet talked about. And Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister for Armaments, said this. He said, "I could see omens of the war's end almost every day in the blue southern sky. When flying provocatively low, the bombers of the American 15th Air Force crossed the Alps from their Italian bases to attack German industrial targets." Okay? So the bombing campaign over Germany is starting to work. And there's a massive historiographical debate about whether this was immoral and strategically useless, the bombing campaign over Germany. I'll refer you to Childers. Childers has a great article about that. Where, yeah, in any case, enough said there. The Allies will land now a second force into southern France from Italy as well, and that happens in August 1944, 2 months after Overlord. Okay? But yeah, 70,000 plus Allied deaths here, and yeah, 300,000 casualties on each side. Okay, and so we get D-Day. Clearly massive, and really the biggest decision Eisenhower has to make in his life is whether to send the forces over, given the weather that day was a bit dicey. Weather and tide windows have to be perfect, hence there's a very short window in the year where it can work, and it wasn't perfect. And in fact, the men sit in boats for 24 hours waiting for the order to go over, and it's finally given, even though the weather was not completely conducive. So real concerns that it will fail. A couple points you want to make here about D-Day is one is about secrecy. So landing over 100,000 men on day one and then 1.5 million by the end of July, which is the plan, that's impossible to keep that a secret. And in fact, the Germans fully expect such an operation, which from a wider perspective is kind of tactically beneficial, because it keeps pressure off the Eastern Front. The Germans have to keep divisions here. In fact, they have 25 divisions on the Atlantic Wall alone, 58 in Western Europe, another 150 in the East. So the two-front problem obviously is the main issue that the Germans face. But in any case, impossible to keep the secret, so a massive deception campaign is initiated, and it's very organized, and they get the Germans to believe two things. One, that the invasion is going to be at multiple points, and secondly, that the main thrust is going to happen where it logically should, from Dover to the Pas de Calais, exactly where the Dunkirk evacuations happened, right, in the fall of France a few years before. So for a long time, the Germans are spread thin along the coast, expecting that second wave that never comes. So that's a brilliant success on the Allied side. Now, another thing is that in the critical first hours, when reports are coming from the Normandy beaches that the invasion force is coming this way, well, at first the Germans don't believe it's a real thing, and then when they determine that it is, they can't get a hold of Hitler because he is sleeping, and that is one of the best stories of World War II. His staff refused to wake him. And why this is a problem is because Hitler, by his own directive, is the only one allowed to allocate and move the panzer divisions, so they have an issue of mobility, a massive one, right? And Germans are divided as well over whether to try and defend along the coast or to keep the bulk of divisions back, and so they've compromised on that as well. Any case, that this is another part of the reason D-Day succeeds. Another is the success of the pre-launch bombing, the raids here, the aerial support. Okay? The Allies have massive air supremacy. Okay? Not supremacy, superiority. Those are very different things. But the Luftwaffe is massively outnumbered by the RAF. On D-Day, 12,000 planes to about 200 on the German side. Okay? Now, the reason the Allies choose where they do the Normandy landings on the Normandy coast here is also, it's not just about the fact that it would be considered the least likely. It's also because an Atlantic port is understood to be impossible to take. And that gets us to the Dieppe raid of 1942, a really tragic raid where largely Canadians, about 5,000, went ashore and tried to take this Atlantic port in 1942 for a variety of reasons. That went into that one is to gather intel and also to test the strength of the Wehrmacht at the Atlantic Wall, and yeah, the Allies totally failed that test. It's impossible to do. The tanks are ground down on the beach, and the men are simply taken out like ducks in a barrel. It's brutal. About 1,000 are killed, 2,000 are taken prisoner, and it's understood after that point, and everyone tries to walk away from having any involvement in that, including Montgomery, but it's understood that a deep water port will be impossible. Okay? So then how do you land all this equipment and all these men if you don't have a deep water port and can't get your ships, obviously your ships can't simply land on the beach, okay? Well, the solution to that is another ingenious thing about D-Day, which is the mulberries. Yeah, I did say mulberries, not a weird name for them. It's a code name, and in fact, the Allies thought that the Germans had figured this out when that word appeared in the London Times crossword, but it was just a coincidence. It's a secret project, construction project, building two of these basically floating deep water ports. So two of these are built and they are floated over in pieces and assembled, one near Omaha, that's Mulberry A, and one near Gold Beach, that's Mulberry B. Now the first one, A, gets damaged in a storm and is taken out of commission, but B keeps operating. In fact, even though it's meant to last only 3 months, it ends up lasting 10, and it sees like 2 million men, 500,000 vehicles, 4 million tons of supplies landed here. And this is a critical part of why this succeeds. This is how the Allies overcame the port issue. Okay, and if you know much about D-Day, maybe you do, you know that it's called Neptune. Actually, these are the Neptune assaults, and each are there's 5 beaches. There is Utah, Omaha, which are American. There's the British beaches of Gold and Sword, and the Canadian of Juno. Each one of these 5 armies is given day 1 objectives. The Canadians are the ones who get closest. Nobody achieves their objectives because the resistance is stronger than had been expected. Okay. So in these maps, that one map on the bottom right shows you the as of June 6, 1944, how far the Allies do manage to get. Now we all know that we've all seen Saving Ryan's Privates. We know how brutal D-Day was, right? Well, was it? Well, let's take a look at that next and see what happens at Omaha Beach. Okay. And yes, 100% Omaha is a brutal bloodbath. Okay, so the landings here are at 6:30 a.m. Okay? It's not till noon that we have breaches of the beachhead, as seen in this map here, and it's midnight before most of the German strong points are cleared, and not all of them. Now, the worst spot here are the 2 ends of the beaches, but particularly the one end, the dog green sector in the west end. Okay, so here what you have is 10 landing crafts are hit before they even gain the beach. They're strafed from the cliffs. Now the reason this happens is because the current and the really rough surf. The infantry are landed at the same time as the tanks, which was not supposed to happen. Most of the tanks are sunk, and the men at the far end of the beach here, they land directly in front of the strongest German defenses. So 2,500 men are killed, mostly in the first hour. Okay, so definitely a meat grinder. But here's the thing: this is put into perspective. That's about 2% of the 120,000 men who landed that day. Overall in D-Day, about 4,000 are killed in action, which is about 1 in 36. And of those 10 LCAs that are hit before they even make it off the water, in the worst case, half those men still made it to the safety of the cliffs. So assuming you have seen Saving Private Ryan, if you haven't, you have to. It's that amazing scene. Yes, it captures the fog of war, but as for D-Day, it's unrepresentative of what most would have experienced. And in fact, you only have to look at Utah Beach to see how very different things are. Here, 23,000 men are landed, and we have only 197 casualties, right? Or 197 killed in action, sorry, 500 casualties. And partly that's because they got blown off course, but in a good way. They land on the wrong beach, which fortunately was not well defended. Teddy Roosevelt Jr. gives his famous line. He has no idea where he is. He says, "We'll start the war from here." In any case, Juno Beach, very like Omaha, actually, the Canadian beach, 50% casualties in the first hour, but not as many as Omaha. At Sword, Monty's biggest problem is logistical. He has almost no casualties. He has simply problems of disembarking. So yeah, Omaha not representative, which I don't know what I'm trying to say to you here other than we take our history from movies, right? And we definitely, that image we have of D-Day is thanks to Spielberg. So I think it's important to discuss that. In as much as that is your image of D-Day, which is not to say sign up next time because this won't happen to you. In any case, it does. It was a reality for a certain small number of men that day, but the wider reality, 150,000 are landed in shortly over 24 hours, 648,000 men in the first 2 weeks, 1.5 million by the end of July. And here's a good image of D-Day 3 days later, and this is how most of those who went ashore would have experienced landing in France. Massive. I love this picture too for giving just a sense of the scale of the operation here. But yes, obviously D-Day does succeed, and the beaches are secured. The road network behind is secured. The battle for Caen takes quite a while, and so now we're into the Battle of Normandy, which becomes a more drawn out affair than the Allies had anticipated or hoped for. 2 months actually of fighting to break out from Normandy and close what was called the Falaise Pocket, and captured 50,000 Germans in doing that. Many Allied deaths here, many civilians killed by air bombardment on the Allied side and also by the Germans. Now, the reason this is such a intense campaign, the Battle of Normandy, is because Hitler's throwing all that he has at the Atlantic Wall. Now he's trying to throw the Allies back into the sea because he knows if he can't, he's completely done for. And at this point, Eisenhower employs what's known as a broad front strategy. There have been debated ahead of time whether to have a singular thrust towards Berlin or to take more of a two-pronged approach between the U.S. main armies, and he goes for that more broad front. Patton massively successfully races past Paris, bypasses it, and he's 60 miles from Germany by September already. The Canadians are sent up the coast in what's called the Cinderella campaign, and there's a race to open more channel ports to the north so we can get more material. And this is the big deal, is trying to get the logistics is the biggest challenge. Right? So securing another deep water port further north is absolutely essential. By September 4, the British and Canadians take Antwerp, and as you may know, that is a port city, but it is an inland port, and the Scheldt estuary is what's between Antwerp and the sea. So now we get the battle for the Scheldt estuary, which takes quite some time and not a few Canadian lives. Now, with the delays of the Battle of Normandy and then with the Scheldt estuary, a plan is conceived largely by Montgomery, pushes for this, for what's called Operation Market Garden, and this is a paratrooper assault to secure what's known as the salient. So this is an area inside enemy territory. So you leapfrog over the Germans and take, namely, these Dutch cities of Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem, and then cross the Rhine by arcing over the north into Germany and around the West Wall. Okay? So famously, this was a bridge too far, fails for all sorts of reasons. But the bigger problem here is now the Allies are dividing their priorities, and having taken Antwerp, their focus was not where it should have been, which is this is the 11th hour Heinrich Monday morning quarterbacking. But in any case, fighting for the Scheldt estuary takes longer than it should have, and the Antwerp approach is because of Market Garden's resources going there, they're not secured until November 29. And then we get another setback for the Allies, which is the Battle of the Bulge. Now, this is Hitler taking advantage of the momentum being on his side temporarily with the failure of Market Garden. Also the fact that Patton's army, the Third Army, had been told to halt, and supplies were not resourced to them because of Market Garden. So December 16, in any case, Germans thinking the Americans are out of steam, not that this is a command decision to temporarily halt the U.S. Army here on the front. They take advantage on December 16th, and there's a massive punch against the weakest spot on the front. 250,000 German men take the Allies completely by surprise. Short aim, they take Bastogne, which is critical crossroads. Bigger aim is get all the way to the coast to Antwerp and then cut the British from the American armies, divide those two, but more importantly, gain the upper hand needed to force the Allies to negotiate. So it's not about winning the war at this point, it's about Germany having the upper hand and avoiding an invasion of the German home front, as they managed to avoid in World War I, and also secure a separate peace with the British and Americans from the Russians. So now you can reallocate all your resources to the Eastern Front where things are not going well. Now the Battle of the Bulge obviously doesn't work, and Patton ends up being the man of the hour here for lifting the siege of Bastogne and pushing the Germans out. But before that happens, each side has 90,000 casualties, and this is the bloodiest battle of World War II for the American Army. 19,000 Americans are killed here, which is more than in any other theater or any other battle in any other theater. Bloodiest battle of the war for them. Okay, so, but yeah, Patton here is now fully vindicated. A function of the broad front strategy, though, on the Allied side is that the Russians are the first to get to Berlin. They've had major successes after the Battle of Kursk on the Eastern Front, Battle of Romania, Battle of White Russia. Any case, that's for hardcore World War II enthusiasts to get into. Enough to say that the Red Army is in Berlin, and this is that famous image of them on top of the Reichstag. Hitler by now is holed up in the Fuhrer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery with a few other devotees. Most Germans are trying to escape to the western lines to get captured by the Americans rather than the Soviets as the noose around Berlin closes. In the Fuhrer bunker, Hitler comes out and is filmed for the very last time, encouraging the Hitler Youth in their defense of the city. Some of the saddest stories of the war are those of the Hitler Youth being given these suicidal roles right at the end as the Russian tanks are coming in. Joseph Goebbels, who's the sycophantic and pathologically deviant propaganda minister under Hitler, he and his wife are also in the Fuhrer bunker. They poison their children and then kill themselves, and that's what the Soviets find as they enter that bunker, which, by the way, stays intact right up until the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. And it is all over on May 7, 1945. This is when General Jodl signs his surrender. And 1 million people come out to hear Churchill, to cheer on Churchill at Whitehall in London. And we have massive turnouts as well, as you can see there in New York City, Times Square, in that famous photograph that makes it into the cover of Life magazine of that celebration. All of which then leads to the question, what's next for Europe? And what's next for Europe will, of course, soon be the Cold War. Now, Churchill had tried to preempt this in what is called the Percentages Agreement, and this was not believed for a long time. He wrote about this in his History of World War II, but until this note surfaced in the 1970s, I believe it was people were skeptical, or historians were skeptical of whether this even happened. But it did happen, and he met together with Stalin in a meeting that would have horrified FDR, who's much more of an idealist. Americans always are, and they're against secret treaties. This goes back to Wilson with the 14 points. We're fighting against this kind of thing. But this is deal-making over what the post-war Europe would look like, and it shows that Churchill is much more realpolitik. He's willing to sit down with Stalin. He recognizes he's an enemy and will be again, even though they're friends, allies during the war, and divvying up Europe so that they can come up with a modus vivendi, how we will move on together. You will have the sphere of influence in these countries, we will have it in these countries. And it kind of is more or less how things do end up being, even though it's not a modus vivendi, it's an out-and-out dangerous Cold War. In any case, Percentages Agreement, interesting stuff. On the American side, one of the unfortunate stories of the end of the war is what's called Operation Paperclip. And perhaps you've heard of the rat lines that got Nazis out of Europe into South America. Well, the same thing obtains for America, that if you're a scientist and your work is important enough on nuclear research or on the V2 rocket program or the Luftwaffe engine assembly plant or whatever, you could be spirited away to America under this program and avoid post-war tribunals. And that's what happens famously to missile man Wernher von Braun, who had worked on the V2 rocket and wore an SS uniform during the war. Now, nobody is forced to be SS. Here's a picture of Wernher von Braun in his SS uniform next to Heinrich Himmler there, and another one of him with some SS officers during the war at some point. And there's another one of him with Walt Disney in 1953. So he's sanitized, he's cleared, and because he's important. Operation Paperclip ultimately took about 1,600 former Germans, engineers and scientists and technicians, all to the States to work for the government in U.S. military, aeronautics, space programs. Many had ties to the Nazi regime, and none of them faced any kind of consequence for that. Okay, so talking about the Cold War gets us a bit ahead. That'll be next lecture, but we also haven't ended World War II. Okay, so victory in Europe doesn't mean the end of the war. That happens months later with the victory over Japan. So let's look at that happens and why it's such a long, drawn-out, brutal slog till the bitter end when Japan really is military not very strong and economically very weak country. And it largely is it's the attitudes, the Bushido ethic of the Japanese soldiers, that no surrender attitude. So I'll unpack that a bit more. But this map is brilliant. It shows us exactly what happens after Pearl Harbor. You see Midway there at the top. 6 months later, that's a massive U.S. victory. They take out three aircraft carriers within 15 minutes from high altitude bombers. A fourth the next day. A huge loss for the Japanese. They shrink their perimeter after that, and then the first face-to-face fighting will happen at Guadalcanal. Now, in this whole campaign, there's a basic tension in between the Navy and the American Navy and the American Army as to how to go about it. General MacArthur of the U.S. Army wants to liberate the Philippines. He had been there. He made that humiliating retreat. He had promised to come back. He's personally committed to that. Admiral Nimitz of the Navy favors a direct drive towards Japan, and then everything else will follow. Clearly, the Japanese can be destroyed at the home front, and the Philippines will. Everything else will be a war prize after that. They will be defeated, which seems to make more sense. In any case, Eisenhower compromises and resources them both, so they cooperate in the retaking of the Philippines. And here we have the biggest naval battle in world history, in fact. So. Point I want to make to you, though, getting back to why it's such a long, drawn-out campaign, it's not about this. It's really about the fighting spirit of the Japanese soldier and the no surrender mentality that they had. Now, if you want to understand the spirit of the Japanese fighting soldier, you might want to read John Dower, War Without Mercy, Race and Power in the Pacific War. And what he gets at in that book is an important point, which is that the Kodahawe faction, which is in charge of Japan at the time, the government there really believes, and which also runs the military, really believes that the more abused a soldier is, the more fierce a fighter he will be. So deprivation, hunger, beatings, this kind of thing. So that's something that the Japanese soldiers are facing. They're also told, and this is massively important, that death in the Imperial Army, which by the way is the Heavenly Army, is instant nirvana. So instant nirvana. This is the end of all suffering. Okay, so death in the Emperor's army is instant nirvana, and that is an axiom that is taught through the state emperor worship system, and there's soldier shrines all over Japan as of the late 19th century. So for decades this has been the idea, and the idea too is that the emperor himself is a direct descendant of the sun god Amaterasu, so he is a deity. Okay, so this helps explain the fanaticism. Also the Bushido ethic, which is much older in Japan, and that goes back much longer than the 19th century, but that idea of no surrender. You fight to the death for your lord and master till the bitter end, right? And certainly they do. Okay, and you see that here. I've given you 3 examples here of these brutal battles on these tiny atolls in the South Pacific. One of them is Tarawa. Here you have 5,000 Japanese killed in action in 76 hours. They managed to kill 1,700 Marines. There's really no cover you can have when attacking an atoll where the highest height of land is often only about 12 feet. Only 17 Japanese allowed themselves to be taken prisoner at the end of that. 17. 5,000 killed. Peleliu, 11,000 Japanese are killed, 1,800 Marines over 3 months, again for a small island. Biak, a tiny island, 10,000 Japanese die there, 500 Marines over 3 months. Now, these, as I say, some of these are dubious command decisions, whether or not some of these islands could have been bypassed and avoid this huge body count, but massively lopsided towards the Japanese, because they will fight to the very end. Now, of course, this means that racism in the United States is against the Japanese is something to behold. Okay, I would say it's unbelievable, but it actually is believable because of what is happening in the Pacific, and it's but it's incredible when you read it. And reading through magazines of the time will give you a sense of that. And a famous example that always comes up is this Life magazine article, and it's pretty shocking and disgusting, but I'll read it to you anyway. And it says this: when he said goodbye 2 years ago to Natalie Nickerson, 20, a war worker of Phoenix, Arizona, a big, handsome Navy lieutenant promised her a Jap. Last week, Natalie received a human skull autographed by her lieutenant and 13 friends and inscribed, "This is a good Jap, a dead one picked up in the New Guinea beach." Natalie, surprised at the gift, named it Tojo. The armed forces disapproves strongly of this sort of thing. Unbelievable. But yeah, it speaks to the time, and it speaks to how the Americans are perceiving the Japanese fighting man, right? Unnecessary death counts, right? Unnecessary death tolls. Why not give up? American prisoners of war in Japanese hands have a 33% chance of dying as well, and that's part of what I talked about earlier, which is that when you have an idea that surrender is to be avoided at all costs, a real soldier doesn't. There's not a lot of empathy then for those who do, for prisoners. Comparatively, only 1 out of every 683 German prisoner of war die in American custody, but very few Japanese manage to be taken prisoner, and often because the Americans are so, the American fighting man sees him as this Unterman by this point, they will not accept surrenders. And part of the problem happens that at Guadalcanal, which is the first face-to-face fighting of the Pacific Campaign, the Japanese soldiers several times fake surrenders in order to shoot Marines. So after that, Marines will not take them prisoner for good reason, because they fear for their lives. And there's a lot of, but then again, many Japanese who do try to surrender will simply be shot. This is a real problem for the U.S. Army, because unless people start surrendering, the war will never end. And so it's as simple as that. So the Americans start creating these leaflets that they then blanket all the Japanese occupied islands with. These cease resistance leaflets, which are to give them, immunity. If you're holding one of these up, that American Marine has to take you as a prisoner and not shoot you. Now, because of the way the Japanese treat prisoners, they expect the same from the Americans, which is part of why they will not surrender. But these leaflets do start to work to some extent, but not as well as hoped. And in fact, as we get closer to the Japanese home islands, as we get to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, you see 25% of the American deaths happen in that brutal battle, Okinawa, right before we get to the Japanese mainland. Okay, these two maps show you Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and show you how close the Americans now are to the Japanese homeland, Kyushu, and close enough to start their intense bombing campaign, which starts in March of that year, with full-scale invasion of Japan slated for November 1945. Okay. By now we're seeing Japanese kamikaze tactics, which is a sign of the fact that the Japanese have lost most of their good pilots, and the ones left are not well trained, so they're still good enough for taking out big ships and huge numbers of Americans. So this too is part of the the intensity of what's happening towards the end here. Yeah, starting with Iwo Jima, the Japanese strategy is one of delay for defense of Japan itself through something called Getsu-go, which is a plan to mass civilian participation in the defense of the home islands. The Americans are figuring that it will take between 250,000 and 500,000 American deaths to invade Japan home islands, which they do not want to do because it gets to go. And hence they begin this bombing campaign. The B-29s are bombing Japanese cities from their bases in Okinawa and in Guam, and the Japanese are still fighting on even after 64 cities are partially or entirely destroyed. 900,000, almost 1 million fatalities, which is far more than we get with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which killed 80,000 and 40,000 respectively instantly, and thousands more later. But nowhere near how many are killed before that. Yeah. Now, in this time period, there's revisionists in the 1960s coined a term called atomic diplomacy, and basically it says that Americans used the atom bomb not to win the war strategically, because they didn't have to. They could have fought on until November. They could have invaded, but they did it in order to gain an upper hand in the Cold War. It's about diplomacy. It's about keeping the Soviets out of this sphere. It's about sending a message that we will dominate in the post-war atomic diplomacy. And one of their biggest arguments is that the Japanese were trying to surrender all summer long. Now, were the Japanese trying to surrender? Well, yes and no. Okay, what they actually wanted was a ceasefire, a truce, where Americans would go home. And that's based on discussions going on among the Big Six in Japan, the Prime Minister and his closest advisors, who are also known as the Supreme Council. Now, the Emperor is directing this, and his idea is to send a message through a back door to the Americans, through the Russians, who they're not yet at war with. And the message is, we want the war over, we're ready to negotiate. So the Supreme Council agreed to this, but they're very clear that they will not surrender. The peace is to be a negotiation in a context in which they fully expect they're going to have the upper hand when if the Americans try and invade Kyushu, so the home islands. Now, anyway, the upshot of that is the ambassador in Moscow does send a message, sends a signal through the Soviets to the U.S., and the Americans are reading Japanese communiques as fast as they're being sent, so they know what's up before it happens. But in any case, what matters is that in response to this, the U.S., Britain, and China issue what's called the Potsdam Declaration. This is during the Potsdam Conference in July that year. And what they did is they laid out the terms of what they expected for Japanese surrender. And the main ones was that a couple things. One is that elimination from office of all Japanese responsible for the war. Secondly, that the Japanese military has to be disarmed and Japan, or at least parts of it, submit to occupation. And third, that surrender would be completely unconditional. And they said they wouldn't deviate from that, and they wouldn't brook any delay in that. There's no mention in there of the emperor, which is the one thing the Japanese are adamant they will not negotiate on. In order that the Japanese public knew their offer, the Allies dropped leaflets all over Japanese cities with the text of the declaration. That was on July 26. Now, in response to that, 2 days later, the Prime Minister of Japan goes on the national radio and he says this. He says, the joint proclamation from the Allies is nothing but a rehash. As for the government, it does not find any important value in it. The government will just makusatsu it. So makusatsu, that term, there's some that say that it's ambivalent, but it really means kill with silence, or it means ignore or treat with contempt. Anyway, it's the response, right? And that we will not go there. Okay, so and it's really maybe just about saving face, and that's another point revisionists make, is that the Americans should have tried harder to let the Supreme Council save face. As it was, they don't, and on August 6 and August 9, the atomic bombs are dropped. Now, when Hiroshima is basically wiped off the map, the Supreme Council goes into emergency meetings, and they are still divided as to whether they should surrender or not. Then, when Nagasaki is hit 3 days later, during another meeting of the Supreme Council, they still cannot decide on surrender. It is only that night that the Emperor wades in and he forces his hand and says, we must surrender or the entire nation will be destroyed, at a point when the Japanese did not understand that the Americans only had enough enriched uranium for those 2 bombs, right? This also plays against the revisionist theses that the bomb could have been a test bomb dropped somewhere in the ocean, which a demonstration bomb. That's the demonstration thesis. The Americans should have tried harder by dropping a demonstration bomb over the ocean or somewhere unpopulated to show the Japanese their potential. But it goes against the fact, one, that the Americans don't know if it will even work, the bombing, and secondly, they don't have enough enriched uranium for more than what they used here. So, and in fact, Truman, who's not a super nuanced individual, he had this to say later. He said, the atom bomb was no great decision. It was merely another powerful weapon in the arsenal of righteousness. He has no doubt that this was needed to save lives. And part of the argument for that is that it's also saving a lot more Japanese lives than it's taking out, which may seem odd, but in that invasion of the home islands with mass civilian participation, that could hold some water. They're certainly saving the lives of a lot of other Marines, but of course it leaves open the moral argument: should civilians pay for with their lives to even if it ends the war faster? When in any case, philosophers reach for proportionality. Just war theory, proportionality is one of the rules in just war theory. Was this proportionate to its goals, to its end goals? And really that's for you to decide with the many, many documents available, the many different historians that debate and argue over this thing still to this day. Right, 50th anniversary of the 1965 publication of Garel Perovitz's Atomic Diplomacy, that book that laid out the revisionist argument that it was really about American imperialism. 50th anniversary of that, he puts out a second book which essentially says exactly the same thing. The two parts were as far apart as ever, and there hasn't really been consensus on that, although Sadeo Osaka, a Japanese historian, wrote a very good article, which I include here, which takes a position more or less that essentially it boils down to Hiroshima was justified. It was a shock effect that was needed to get the Japanese out of the war. Nagasaki was not. Okay, that's simplifying what Assad is saying, and he's interesting because he's using Japanese documents. Most of the American historians are arguing using American documents and do not read Japanese, but he's giving us from the Japanese side. Any case, that is the story and the glory, and yeah, the atom bombing is often seen as the first volley in the Cold War, which is where we're going next. So that is World War II. That is a full meal deal if there ever was one, and I hope you learned a lot. And yeah, and if you have any questions at all, 100% let me know.